Russian forces have begun the second phase of their war in Ukraine with an expected push in the eastern Donbas region. But Ukrainian officials said they were confident they could hold off the offensive. Till now, neither side has offered any hint of compromise. In fact, positions in both Moscow and Kiev seem to have hardened. My guest this week offers a unique perspective. She's Nina Khrushcheva, great-granddaughter of the former Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. And she joins me this week from New York, where she's Professor of International Affairs at the New School. As the war goes on, she believes the dangers are rising.
Any show of force will be responded by a show of force. And it does seem, what my fear is, that it does seem that Putin is ready, as I said, to take Russia, Ukraine, and everybody else down with him. Is the West, is the United States ready for that?
For now, the mood in Washington is somber. The US is said to be pushing for Russia's complete isolation on top of punitive economic sanctions. But would that weaken Putin or make him even more dangerous? And what of the man himself? Is he a bluffer, a gambler, astute politician, or ruthless bully? What was it that took him all the way to the most powerful office in Russia? That and much more on Conflict Zone. Nina Khrushcheva, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you very much.
As the war goes into its second phase in Ukraine, Mr. Putin continues to insist that everything's going to plan. Nothing could actually be further from the truth, could it?
Well, we don't know what exactly the plan was, so I guess he can say anything. I mean, it does seem that the plan was to finish this war, or as they call it, the special military operation in Donetsk and Luhansk much faster, but now we're entering the third month of it. And now, actually, it seems to me that the final plan, concentration on Donetsk and Luhansk, seems to be beginning. But they continue to insist, as you said, it's going to plan. And also, let's remember that May 9th, the anniversary of World War II victory, is going to be celebrated in Moscow. Usually it's celebrated as a great parade. And so far, we were sure that the parade is still going to go on. So there will be, or at least people expect, some sort of declaration of victory. Whatever that victory may mean, we don't know. Probably would be the taking over from Ukraine the city of Mariupol.
What's left of it? What's left of it?
What's left of it, exactly. I just wanted to say, I mean, they've been going it for 2 months. And they've been promising it any day now. So it's still any day now. But that could be, by May 9th, that could be that declaration of victory.
I'm assuming that the plan was not to lose their flagship in the Black Sea, the Moskva, not to lose at least 7 generals, and not to have to admit to significant troop losses. How far do you think the prestige of their armed forces has suffered as a result of these setbacks?
Well, it suffered, I think. I mean, because we didn't, I mean, one of the, I think, the many horrible, stupid and horrible and crimes and mistakes that Putin has made, but one of them is actually show to the world how incompetent Russia are, because everybody else before the war expected that it's, you know, it's so terrifying because Russian military is so strong and formidable. And now we've seen that the world has seen that it really not. So of course, these are the costs of war. I mean, things are not going according to plan, and it's very idiotic of Putin really expose this kind of shortcomings that the army has. So yes, there is a lot of prestige damage. But since, as you know, in Russia now you can't say anything except what the Kremlin tells you or the Ministry of Defense tells you. So what kind of prestige that is? They can make up any story. And really, at this point in time, I mean, you covered Soviet Union and then Russia, they always lied, but now they're just lying through their teeth at all times. So nobody, supposedly in Russia, nobody knows what the truth is. And so they can claim, as I said, any victory. They can pretend that the losses are not happening, that Moskva was just a little setback and so on.
We've seen reports of high-ranking Russian personnel arrested, some now in jail, apparently, some others under house arrest. How high is the price of failure in Russia these days? How high is Putin making it?
Well, I think it came sort of one of the things that people were trying to really understand how that whole miscalculation happened. I mean, clearly Putin had an idea of Ukraine and the Nazi, as they say, government in Ukraine. It was fed to him by his security apparatus, people who are responsible for clandestine intelligence. And since now we know for sure that nobody expected that war, nobody even thought that it could be that remarkably stupid to go and invade another country in front of the eyes of the whole world. So he was fed that kind of mythology of Ukrainians wanting to join with the Russians because they don't want to turn to the West or some such. So we know that that happened. And now but there's also not really reliable information. I mean, some say that thousands of high-level, mid-level officials were being either removed or being under house arrest. We don't know exactly that that's happening. I mean, there's still Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, is kind of randomly showing in public, and we don't really know whether it's him showing in public or some footage from the past. So the rumors are that there are a lot of purges going on, but we still didn't have the evidence of that. On the other hand, as you know, the Russian government is so secretive that we would know when it is already too late and these people are either imprisoned or prosecuted for those failures in Ukraine. But we haven't gotten to that step yet when we know exactly what is going on. But purges certainly either are already happening or will be happening soon enough.
And that creates the danger of some pretty powerful enemies for Putin, doesn't it? I suppose having changed the constitution, he's set to stay in power for, up to another 14 years. That's plenty of time for resentments to build up within the system, isn't it? Isn't there always a risk in one-party states that the administration turns into a kind of pressure cooker in danger of exploding from all the pent-up intrigues, frustrations and hatreds inside it? Are there any signs of that so far?
So far, no. But as you said, 14 years is a long time. So no, so far, not at all. And in fact, it's interesting that when the invasion happened, there was a lot of shock. And we know at the Security Council meeting on February 21st, Putin supposedly closed his confidence. It was broadcast for everybody to see, was just in shock and horror. And the clandestine official, the head of the clandestine operations, Narishkin, Sergei Narishkin, was the one who just he was staring all the time because he couldn't believe what's happening. But then they figured it out very quickly. They rallied around the flag. And it's a very unpopular thing to say here in America, but not the sanctions so far, but the absolute ostracism, basically an economic, cultural, humanitarian, any other war on Russia and the Russians, in fact, helped to unite Putin, to unite people and his elites right now around the Kremlin, precisely because they have no other future in the West. So all their future is now in Russia. So they have to behave. So in some ways, it was almost a KGB, not a KGB, but a security mid-level gray apparatchik coup. With Putin at the head against those like Narishkin or some other hardliners who would still understand, who still understood that Russia relations to the West, even if it is not of partnership, but some sort of competition, still was absolutely important. So I do think that maybe resentment will build in 14 years or in maybe even less years. But so far, even without Putin, the KGB, I call it sort of as a collective term, the security apparatus, the controlling apparatus is going to continue. They're not going to give up power.
I want to look a little later, if we may, at the effect of some of the sanctions on Russia, which you've just alluded to, and how that might affect Putin's standing. But as the war goes on, we've seen these allegations of war crimes piling up. We're seeing what the UN calls credible allegations of rape, summary executions, civilian deportations. How do you account for these? Are the troops instructed to do as they like? Are they promised impunity?
Well, as a Russian, we could be very violent. I know that as a Russian, but I myself am shocked of how completely criminal this behavior has been. And what I also learned, and actually the outlet Meduza, which was declared a foreign agent, now most of the independent outlets in Russia writing about Russia declared a foreign agent. That is, they don't provide credible information and so on. They've done a lot of investigation about this, and it's just absolutely heartbreaking and shocking to see that evidence. But what also is learned, at least what I learned from Meduza and others, is that it depends on who was in charge of, because the troops were moved all the time, because that war was a shock, it seems to me, even to the military, the way it's been conducted, because they didn't know when exactly they would go in, how far they would go in, and so on and so forth. So it was conducted, I mean, the preparation was a very clandestine operation in a sense. And so the troops were moved. For example, the most brutal of them is the Chechen battalions. And we've seen the president of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, can be talking about completely elimination of, you know, the Nazi Ukrainians altogether, going all the way. There is also another troops of Russian Guard, Rosgvardia, also supposedly, Putin is in charge of that. I mean, they respond directly to him. They were also the ones who were just eliminating everything. So it depends on what the troops were. So, but what it shows is that complete discombobulation of the organization of this war. So people or troops actually acted as they pleased, depending on the low-level commanders, without high-level organizational structure at all.
Professor Khrushcheva, you've met Vladimir Putin. Where does he fit into the spectrum of Russian and Soviet leaders? More irrational, more unpredictable? How does he fit into the scheme of things?
Well, I met him. Thank you. I met him long time ago. So it was a little Putin, as we say, young Putin, a baby Putin. I met him when he was just the prime minister in '99. So he had 22 years to grow up and to become the Putin that we talk about all the time today. Well, actually, he seemed to be rather tactically calculating, and we saw it in Georgia in 2008. When he responded to Mikhail Saakashvili, then president, to bomb Valley with very quick operation in Georgia. Then in Crimea in 2014, sending little green men, annexing Crimea, but doing it without too much blood being dropped. So now this seems to be just completely off the cliff, because it seems to be a strategic decision, but, you know, Russians are never good at strategy. Putin was good at tactics. So it is kind of an interesting thing. And suddenly he fell off the cliff and showed that he was completely ready to basically not only destroy Ukraine, take down Russia with him, but also damage the world in the process, which is a bit shocking.
From what you're saying, it doesn't sound as though he's the kind of man your great-grandfather might have found much of a use for.
Well, I mean, it is interesting.
Or as an enforcer, perhaps.
Right. That whole crisis with Ukraine early on was compared to the Cuban Missile Crisis, that they sort of stood next to the brink, and then they're going to pull out the way Khrushchev and Kennedy did in 1962. And so, as you know, Khrushchev's reputation that he was very, they could be rash, he could be excitable, he was he could be a very bombastic. And now when I'm looking at Putin and this operation, I think, wow, Khrushchev was just zen comparing to what happened in Ukraine now. We are so past the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was resolved in 13 days when the world really got to the brink of potential destruction. So now clearly Putin is not stopped. But I think Putin's role model, what I'm looking at, is Yuri Andropov. You remember the KGB had for many years, always actually, by the way, was always advocating for sending, when the Soviet Union was threatened, or the system was threatened in '56 in Hungary, in '68 in Czechoslovakia, then in Afghanistan, with Afghanistan in '79. He was the big advocate of sending troops and defending in existential state of the Soviet Union. So Putin seems to be taking cues from that man. We don't
Looking
know.
at Putin's background and his time in the KGB, they don't seem to have been that impressed with him, do they? If he'd been on the fast track, he would have been sent to the West, but he got East Germany instead, which wasn't much of a consolation prize, was it, if you were in the foreign department of the KGB?
Well, I mean, he still was sent abroad, so that wasn't bad either. But he was just a lieutenant colonel, and there were some other people who were in Putin's entourage. For example, Sergei Ivanov, who was many times his various jobs held in the Putin administration, and was defense minister. He was told he was lieutenant general, and it was kind of a question as to why the gray Putin became the president, why the tall and quite impressive Ivanov did not. So it has been a very big question. But I think Andropov holds key, as I said, he holds key to Putin's behavior, because only under Andropov and Putin, because Andropov was the KGB head and Putin was the head of the FSB, the successor to KGB for a little bit, and then both in charge of the whole country. During these two administrations, these two leaders, the Soviet Union under Andropov and Russia under Putin, really became a KGB state, a security state. That has never happened under any other administration. Even under Stalin, there was still a separation between security and prosecution and the state.
Right up until February the 24th, you didn't believe that Putin was going to attack Ukraine. What did you think was holding him back?
Well, I didn't believe exactly as I just described. I mean, he seemed to be tactically rational. And what I was saying,
and he's proved he isn't.
He proved completely is not. I mean, I was analyzing him as a politician. I mean, he is an autocrat and authoritarian, but still I was thinking that there's some political thought process going on in his head. And every time when the American intelligence was saying, well, there's a road to Kiev, I was like, well, it's insane. This is suicidal. It goes against every and all national interests that Russia has. And Putin should not be not understanding that. But clearly I was wrong. I think in the COVID times, I mean, it's kind of a bad post-COVID syndrome when he was isolated, that very few people were getting close to him. It does seem that some giant geopolitical map was created in his head, and he just thought that via Ukraine, through Ukraine, he is going to take on the whole West and show, especially the United States, that Russia can also meddle in other countries, militarily in other countries' existence, as the United States did, for example, in Iraq. So that seemed to be a strategic miscalculation of a 1,000-year, or at least 100-year, not at least 100-year proportion, and they did not expect that from Putin.
But violence has been a hallmark of his time in office, hasn't it? Whether it's disposing of his political allies or the whole Chechen war when he was prime minister. That's not a surprise, is it? That he resorts to extreme violence and is capable of it at any time.
It's not a surprise, but the extremity of it still was shocking, because even in Chechnya in '99, when his people, I don't think it's a direct order ever from Putin. I mean, one of the hallmarks of this regime is that they all just guess what the great man may want. It was a targeted offenses, but now it's just an offense to not only to Ukraine, but to the whole world. So yes, I mean, I think as a dictatorial mind, in a sense, does escalate. So when I was analyzing him as a politician, I should have already understood that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And after 22 years, he didn't have other choice than to have this idea of grandiosity. I mean, his absolutely ego that have grown in 22 years to the size of the universe. So no, it's not a surprise.
And his desire, as you were indicating.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, not a surprise, but it's still a shock.
Whatever reasons they've put forward for the invasion of Ukraine, somehow the fact that America might be involved in it seems to be of priority as far as Putin is concerned. Is that right? Do you think he wants a war with the US?
I don't think he wants the war with the US, but he does say to Biden, bring it on. He has said to Biden, bring it on. One of the reasons I think he did is because he didn't think that Biden would bring it on.
Reports last week from Washington indicate that America and its allies are now set on totally rewriting their approach to Russia. Officials are speaking of a world in which the West no longer tries to coexist and cooperate with Moscow, but actively seeks to isolate and weaken it as a matter of long-term strategy. You wrote last month the greatest potential downside of Russia's isolation is that it will make the Kremlin even more dangerous. Do you still think that way?
I do think that way. I think and I said when, now the Russians sort of turned around the flag, rallied around the flag quite a bit. It seems to be that they would have no other choice than if they can, to live in the country that they now have, and therefore protect and justify the country that now have. But as you said earlier, 14 years is a long, long time. A lot can happen. A lot can happen very, very soon. So that may not be the case for Russia to continue on this absolute downward spiral, although I do believe that the security forces are going to be in control, but probably less toxic to the world if something may happen to Putin. The problem with the world is that whatever the government is in Russia, it's going to be very, very difficult, again, to make the world trust it, to actually have the world return to it. And that is a great danger for any system in the Kremlin, but we're not there yet, because it could be, and it probably very likely be, 1991 repetition when the Soviet Union collapsed, so Russia will collapse the same way. But when it happened and how it happens, we do not know.
If you don't think it's a great idea for the West to isolate Russia, what alternatives do Western leaders have to respond to the most serious act of military aggression in Europe since World War II? What options do they have, if not to take it out on the people themselves and bring in huge sanctions and punitive sanctions and isolate Russia from sporting, cultural, educational exchanges, things like that? They don't have many options, do they? They don't have many tools at their disposal.
No, they don't. But also so far, the expectation that the sanctions will happen, Disney will withdraw from Russia, or Harry Potter is not going to be shown, and McDonald's moves out, it's going to turn Putin and say, oh, I see the errors of my way. I'm not going to continue. Yes, it is possible. It probably likely that that the armed forces will have no support. It will be Putin will bog down in this war, like the Soviet Union, in fact, got bogged down in Afghanistan and had to withdraw in '89 and collapse shortly after. That's a possibility, but it doesn't. So unless if the destruction of Russia is a final aim, yes, that will happen. If it is to change Putin's or even Russia behavior, it's not going to happen. So I'm not entirely sure if we're looking at the destruction of Russia, fine, that's all good. But then it also tells the Russians that the West wants to destroy us, just as Putin said. So we have to be behind the country's behavior, and we have to try to withstand it, to survive it as much as we can. So I think it is one of those problems that really has absolutely no solution. But one thing I want to say, that those punishment of getting out the diplomats out of Russia, or kicking out Russian diplomats, I think it is a ridiculous policy if anybody had that policy, because once the countries are in crisis, you need more diplomacy, not less. And that, I think, is a giant, giant mistake.
Is NATO right to be scared that Putin might use nuclear weapons? Isn't there some reason to think that Putin backs away from a fight if someone directly confronts him? I'm thinking of what happened in 2015 when Turkey's President Erdogan warned him about Russian planes violating Turkish airspace. Putin asked him to treat them as guests, and Erdogan replied that they're uninvited guests and shot one of them down. There was no response from Putin. Is that a rather telling episode, do you think?
I don't think so, because actually Erdogan and Putin have been doing this dance for quite some time. And ultimately, Putin, I mean, actually, as you may remember, there was a response because Putin ordered to get planes out of Turkey, and the Russians couldn't go to Turkish resort places. And
but he didn't retaliate in kind. He
retaliated a different way. He retaliated a different way. But I don't think with the West it's going to be the same. I think with the West is that he is, as you said, I mean, I think he's so obsessed and so concentrated. So any show of force will be responded by a show of force. And it does seem, what my fear is, that it does seem that Putin is ready, as I said, to take Russia, Ukraine, and everybody else down with him. Is the West, is the United States ready for that?
Nina Khrushcheva, thanks very much for being on Conflict Zone. Appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.